Um, Psychological safety, as you quite rightly say, is something we've been talking about for a long time. It's definitely having a massive renaissance over the last 2 years. And I think that a lot of that is to do with, from an organizational perspective, we're looking at health and well-being and wellness, COVID, etc. But then we're thinking about psychological health and safety and how they link with each other. What's new in that space? Well, I tell you what, there's a lot of noise, but actually I'm questioning how many people actually understand how to instill and disseminate psychological safety in what we do every day. So, one of the things that we're seeing an advancement on is, if I'm a manager, I have a responsibility, if I'm sensible, to make sure everyone in my team feels safe. Now, that's not only a moral, ethical responsibility, it's also, as we know, within FS and legal, compliance, and the regulators are pushing towards speak up, listen up. But how do I actually do it? What do I need to do more to create meetings where people feel safe to talk? Because, and it links with your earlier question, if one of the fundamental priorities for organizations at the moment is culture, retention of, how do we retain culture when the walls are now opaque, where work is less of a place I go to and more of a thing I do? How do I create psychological safety in a meeting so that everybody can talk and people can thrive? And I think it's hard because there is a demarcation, isn't there, Kirsten, between being in an office and me being in a room with you and having a tea and a coffee and chatting and the energy that comes from that, and me phoning in from, Kent on a screen and seeing a bunch of people in a boardroom. That immediately there is an in-group and an out-group. And I think that it's, one of our challenges is, how do we create safety in meetings so that all voices are heard? Yeah. And that again is empathy, listening, and it's about a more evolved form of leadership that recognizes that difference and is helping to bring people on in ways that work for them in the meeting, so we can hear all voices, and recognizing the different neurological sort of ways in which people process information, the different ways people might speak or not speak, etc. But what in answering your question, psychological safety is now becoming more granular. How do I create it in meetings, in one-to-ones, in team events, in marketing, networking, engagement, employee experience? So it's got to become more granular. Yeah. And speak up, listen up also links with inclusive language. So there are a lot of tentacles here around getting this right, I think, a lot of tentacles. But actually, one of the most interesting things that I begin to notice is technology and inclusion, EDI. How are those, developing together? What are we seeing now that you and I were not seeing a year ago? And one of these things is the rapid advancement of technology to keep up to pace with us all working in a hybrid world. And using virtual meeting tools can enhance inclusion. So what do I mean by that? So I've seen examples of companies that use VR and AR to make workplaces come alive. So huge screens. It sounds a bit weird, but I'm off a laptop now. You're a very tiny thumbnail. But if I were to go into an office, let's say down the road in London, it may be much better if actually the screens in my meeting room were life-size. So actually I can see you life-size. Might be a bit scary, but I can see you life-size and you can see me. And I'm seeing more of these tools used that, again, bring people into the room rather than being, I've got the dynamic in the meeting, but there are just a few thumbnails up there.
Yeah. Interesting. And Uma, thanks for your comments. Incredibly challenging in hybrid working. And I think it's an interesting point about going granular at the moment. But then also thinking about that perhaps global connectivity that we always talk about as well, Sasha, but what that means when you're dealing with different cultural backgrounds, sitting internationally somewhere, as Uma said. Again, anything you sort of would like to comment on there?
Again, the cultural sensitivities and the cultural awareness are very much vital in terms of that toolkit that leaders and managers need to have.
Mm.
Ironically, the soft skills are the hard skills. But if we're looking at,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, a Deloitte's model of inclusive leadership, that cultural awareness, cultural competence, and understanding
Mm.
of what works for different people
Mm-hmm.
in different cultures, etc. And taking the point that some people will naturally not want to be very verbose in meetings or share ideas. So I think that links as well with a better understanding of neurodiversity as well in terms of how people want to contribute. But
Yeah.
yes, always having an awareness. So the responsibility incumbent on managers in 2022 and beyond to educate themselves around diversity and its many different facets and intersections,
Mm-hmm.
and to be better listeners and to encourage more storytelling. We've talked a lot about storytelling in the past, but again, I
Mm-hmm.
see this as huge because empathy is charged when people tell their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can encourage people to be more vocal, so more lived experiences, more, and we've seen a lot of this post Black Lives Matter, where Black voices talked up in organizations and talked about the trauma of microaggressions, and people of color have talked about their lived experiences, and we're seeing this a lot. And I think that's helped. It's helped drive empathy, but there's also a real danger. We cannot expect people who are always on the receiving end of behaviours that are absolutely not okay to keep telling their story. There's responsibility of us as humans to educate ourselves, to learn, to read books, to educate
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. Not by expecting other people always to tell their story, but also to do the work. And I think it's a balance, really.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point. I was going to ask a little bit more when we're talking about sort of courageous conversations. You know, you've got the culture, say the culture is there of that sort of psychological safety, and people are able to speak up, but they could then be worried about saying the wrong thing. And I think there's a lot of talk at the moment around sort of inclusive language and the importance of that. But what happens if it goes wrong?
Yeah, no, exactly. So, how important is language for to create, maintain, and embed an inclusive culture? And the answer to that is very important. But to your point, there's a real fear around this. There's a real fear around language, and if I'm scared of something, it's easier for me to stay in my comfort zone, stay in my lane, say nothing. So where do we see the fear? We see the fear across organizations globally. So that's you and me, that's leadership, that's board, that's HR, that's lots and lots of people are worried about saying the wrong thing. Because let's work on the assumption that fundamentally, most human beings are decent people, and we think if I use the wrong words around race, around that LGBTQ plus alphabet soup, around disability, around mental health, I'm going to upset somebody else. So I won't speak about it at all. So we brush it under the carpet, very British. Let's not have a conversation. And the fear paralyzes. And then the fear means that also, I think people in senior positions are very frightened to have inclusion and diversity conversations because they think, oh, we're going to get that wrong, so we don't have them. We pay lip service to it, but we don't have them.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is, actually, the time is now to lean into courageous conversations, to talk to each other about issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, and much more subtle versions of microaggressions, but to lean into those conversations with the knowledge that we may actually upset people, we may get it wrong, we may inadvertently deeply upset people. If we assume a positive intent to try and get it right, and we educate ourselves around the current best and next practice around language in terms of race, in terms of LGBT, in terms of um, gender identity, all those things, then we're going in the right direction. But that can feel a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I do predict an absolute increase in the need for education for people to become more what we call I&D fluent, inclusion and diversity fluent, and to be able to embrace language around the intersections of all elements of diversity, from neurodiversity to mental health and wellness, through to people of race, ethnicity, culture, identity, the whole gambit. And that can seem incredibly overwhelming, but it's absolutely possible.